The Pennsylvania mountains in November weren't just cold, they were a hollow, biting void that sucked the heat right out of your marrow. I was working the graveyard shift at the Millers Creek Coal Depot, a place that felt like it had been abandoned by God sometime around 1995. My job was manual, brutal, and mind-numbing. I had to stand on the slick, frozen platforms, wrestle with rusted iron levers that felt like they were frozen in place, and manually shovel the overflow of coal into the train cars. My hands were permanently stained with a fine, oily soot that didn't wash off, no matter how hard I scrubbed. The depot was nestled in a valley so deep the sun didn't hit it until noon, and by the time I was starting my shift at 11 p.m., the darkness was absolute, heavy, and claustrophobic. I was 22, desperate for the money to pay off some stupid debts, and this place was the only one hiring. The foreman, a man who spoke in grunts and smelled like cheap tobacco, had given me a lantern and a set of instructions that mostly boiled down to, don't stop, don't look too close, and for the love of everything, don't climb inside the storage silos. I didn't plan on it. I just wanted to get through the night without losing a finger to the machinery. The depot consisted of 4 massive, concrete silos that loomed over the tracks like monolithic headstones. They were old, built back when the mines were booming, and they groaned in the wind like living things. Every time I pulled the iron lever to open the chute, the coal would pour out with a sound like a landslide, dry, rattling, and relentless. It was mid-November, and the first snow was starting to whip through the valley, turning the air into a chaotic swirl of gray. I was digging out a jam near the primary chute when I saw the first anomaly. Most of the coal was crushed, fine, and consistent, but as I shoveled, a pile of stuff hit the iron grate that wasn't coal at all. It looked like a handful of debris, a rusted-out pocket watch, the casing cracked and stained, and a leather boot, flattened like it had been crushed under 1,000,000 tons of pressure. I stared at it, my heart doing a stutter step. The watch was still ticking, a faint, metallic click-click-click that sounded impossibly loud against the howling wind. I reached out to touch it, but the boot fell away, revealing a tangled mess of what looked like human hair, matted with mud and coal dust. I dropped my shovel, the metallic clatter echoing through the yard like a gunshot. The air suddenly felt thinner, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal reaction to something that didn't make any sense. There were no mines nearby, at least, not active ones, so where was this coming from? I looked up at the towering, dark silhouette of the silos. The wind shrieked through the support beams, and for a split second, I heard it, a thud. Then another. A rhythmic, heavy pounding coming from deep inside the central silo. It wasn't the sound of shifting coal. It was a knock. Someone, or something, was banging on the inside of the concrete, a desperate, deliberate call for help from a place where nothing living should have been. I backed away, my breath coming in jagged, freezing gasps, and realized that my shift had only just begun. Every shadow seemed to have teeth, and the towering silos cast long, distorted shapes that danced across the frozen yard like specters. I tried to convince myself that this was just a structural settling, that old concrete groaned and shifted under the pressure of tons of stored carbon. But the logic felt paper-thin. A mechanical groan would be a shriek of metal, a settling of earth would be a rumble, but this was a tap, a distinct, measured, 4-beat rap that sounded almost like someone knocking on a front door. It was the sound of an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I picked up my lantern, the light shaking in my hand, and tried to focus on the task at hand. I had a train to load. If I got distracted, if I missed my quota, the foreman would pull my pay, and I'd be even deeper in the hole I was currently digging for myself. As I shoveled, the coals seemed to whisper. It wasn't human speech, but a soft, sliding friction of billions of shards rubbing against each other. It sounded like voices hushed in a crowd, a low-frequency hum that vibrated directly against my teeth. I focused on the mechanical rhythm of the work, asterisk scoop, lift, dump, repeat, asterisk, but the debris kept coming. A rusted ring, a strip of fabric that looked like it had been torn from a work shirt, and then, the worst part, a piece of a fingernail, polished and clean, discarded among the dust. My stomach churned. I wasn't just moving energy, I was moving the wreckage of lives that had been chewed up and spit out by the mountain long before I had born. The silence of the mountains felt like it was closing in, a heavy, velvet weight that pressed against my lungs. I was alone, miles from town, with only knocking for company. The silence of the valley was a lie, a thin, fragile skin stretched over a boiling, necrotic reality. It was a pressurized, expectant stillness that hummed just below the threshold of human hearing, vibrating with the psychic energy of 1,000 agonizing, unfinished ends. I stood frozen on the platform, the shovel slipping from my numb, white-knuckled fingers to clatter against the iron grate like a funeral bell. That knocking, it wasn't settling. It was a rhythmic, calculated interrogation. Asterisk thump. Thump thump. Thump, asterisk 4 beats. It felt like a bloated, failing heartbeat, or perhaps a cryptic, rhythmic code designed to bypass the conscious mind and reach straight into the primitive, lizard-brain part of me that understood exactly what a soul-starved predator sounded like. I scanned the yard, the beam of my lantern flailing wildly against the monolithic, tomb-like silos. Nothing moved except the snow, which fell in thick, heavy curtains of ice that blurred the edges of reality and seemed to whisper my doom. I tried to regain my focus, but the air around the central silo felt different, colder, denser, and reeking of ozone, copper, and the nauseating, stagnant scent of ancient, damp earth and decaying meat. I walked toward the base of the tower, my boots crunching on the frozen, jagged gravel with a sound that seemed to scream into the dead, empty night. I needed to see if the gate was secure, though my spirit was fraying like a rope soaked in acid. I reached the iron chute, and my breath hitched, turning to frost in the throat-tightening dark. There were scratch marks on the metal, deep, jagged, and frantic furrows that hadn't been there when I'd started the shift. They looked like they'd been gouged by fingernails stripped down to the quick or, God help me, splintered bone. I knelt down, the biting, murderous cold searing through my jeans, and pressed my ear against the vibrating, sweating concrete. For a heartbeat, there was only the wind's high, mournful wail. Then, I heard it. A faint, sickeningly wet sound, like a bloated hand dragging across a damp, putrid surface, followed by a low, hollow, and guttural moan that echoed from deep within the silo's dark, suffocating, and digestive bowels. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was human, or at least, it had once been, before the darkness had hollowed it out into a grotesque vessel of misery. It was the sound of someone who had spent decades waiting in the suffocating dark, forgetting the light, forgetting their own name, and finally, just forgetting how to be anything other than a hungry, trapped, and hate-filled thing. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped, frantic bird desperate to burst out of its cage. I wasn't alone. I was the warden of a massive, industrial tomb I hadn't realized I was guarding, and the prisoners were hungry. I scrambled back to the platform, my eyes darting from the silo to the perimeter of the depot, sensing a tightening noose. The shadows seemed to be thickening, stretching out from the edges of the yard like pale, elongated fingers trying to grasp at the fading, pathetic light of my lantern. I felt the overwhelming, oppressive sensation of being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by a dozen, 100, the collective, hollow, and envious gaze of everything that had been lost in this valley. I remembered the stories my grandfather used to tell about the mines, about how the mountain demanded a bloody, sacrificial toll, about how some things just didn't stay dead when the earth clawed them back into its rotting grip. I'd laughed them off back then, a kid in a warm living room, but here, in the freezing, absolute dark, they didn't feel like stories anymore. They felt like a dying, final prophecy written in frost and gore. I grabbed the lantern and stumbled toward the shack, needing the thin, flickering, and deceptive comfort of the yellow bulb. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the light, and for a moment, I was plunged into total, suffocating, and velvety blackness. In that instant, I heard it again, a whisper, close enough to brush against my ear, a sound of dry, cracked, and weeping lips moving in the dark. Miller. It wasn't a name I recognized, but it was a name that felt like a death debt being called in by the abyss. I reached out, my fingers scrambling on the gravel until I found the lantern, and I stumbled to my feet, running toward the shack without looking back. As I slammed the door and threw the bolt, I saw them, just for a flicker of a second in the distance, the silhouettes of men standing in the silos, their heads bowed, waiting, watching, their very existence a silent, rhythmic, and soul-chilling call to the darkness. I locked the door, but I knew, with the cold, hard, and terminal clarity of the truly terrified, that the lock wouldn't hold against the suffocating, crushing weight of the past. Quick note, this channel is full of horror stories, and I've created a large playlist so you can choose what suits you best, whether you want to fall asleep to a scary story or enjoy an evening with your family, siblings, friends, or grandchildren. Everyone will love it. Don't worry, I'll make you proud in front of them. Let's continue, boss. The shack was my only island of sanity in a sea of encroaching dread. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, listening to the wind howl against the corrugated metal walls. The yellow bulb overhead flickered, casting nervous, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for me from every corner. I needed to focus, to ground myself in the mundane, so I turned to the desk. There, covered in a thick layer of dust, lay the ledger I'd ignored for weeks. It was a relic, a heavy, leather-bound volume that smelled of damp paper and old, forgotten secrets. I sat down, the wooden chair groaning under my weight, and opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and filled with the frantic, precise handwriting of a man who had clearly lost his grip on reality. The entries were mostly routine, documenting coal tonnage, train schedules, and maintenance logs. But as I flipped toward the back of the book, the script grew jagged and uneven. Asterisk May 14, 1932, the seam collapsed today. 12 men down. We couldn't get them out. The shaft was flooded with sludge and silt. We had to seal it. The company said they were lost. But we can still hear them. They're in the silos now. The machinery pulls them up, a little bit every night. They don't die. They just get mixed in with the coal. Asterisk my blood turned to ice. The words were a haunting, articulate confirmation of the nightmare I was living. I traced the ink with a trembling finger, the lines feeling like grooves in a headstone. I looked at the dates. The entries ended abruptly, the last page torn away, but the final, frantic scrawl caught my eye. Asterisk they are the coal. We are the fuel. The machinery must be fed, or it feeds on us. Asterisk I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing like a pistol shot in the small, cramped shack. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, a way to dismiss the terror as the hallucination of a sleep-deprived brain. But I couldn't. I had seen the debris, the watch, the boot, the hair. I had heard the knocking. This wasn't a nightmare, it was an inheritance. I was the current steward of a legacy of suffering, a debt that had been compounding in the dark for over 70 years. I stood up, pacing the small room, the lantern light shivering as the wind buffeted the shack. I had to leave. I had to drop the shift, walk to the gate, and just keep walking until I reached the highway. But the depot was a prison, and I was the prisoner who held the only key. If I left, if I stopped the machinery, what would happen to them? Would they break out? Would they finally be able to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them, or would they just be trapped in the silos forever, hungry and forgotten? The questions spiraled in my mind, a toxic, blinding web of doubt. I was a young man with debts to pay, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark, dirt-streaked window, I saw someone else, a hollow-eyed stranger who was already beginning to fade. Then, the knocking started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the silos. It was coming from the door of the shack. Asterisk thump. Thump thump. Thump, asterisk. It was the same rhythm, the same patient, deliberate code. My hand hovered over the bolt, but I couldn't bring myself to slide it back. I knew who was on the other side. They weren't coming for my money, and they weren't coming for my life. They were coming for my labor. They were coming for the shift. I backed away, my heart hammering, and saw the door handle slowly begin to rotate. The wood groaned, the hinges shrieked, and a sliver of the freezing, midnight air crept into the room, smelling of coal, wet earth, and the lingering, metallic scent of the abyss. I was the keeper, and the night was just beginning. The door creaked, wood groaning under the pressure of something heavy, dead, and rotting. I threw my weight against the frame, shouting for someone to hear me, though I knew I was abandoned in this hell. There was no response, only faint, rhythmic scratching on the other side. It was precise, like someone carving a bloody message into the rot. I dropped to the floor and looked through the gap. I saw boots, the same I'd seen in the coal pile, old, cracked leather, caked in decades of dried filth and human gore. They stood still, as if the thing wearing them waited for me to stop fighting the inevitable, agonizing end. I cried, sound muffled by my trembling hands, as the realization hit, these weren't ghosts. They were something far worse, physical, pulsant, bound to this cursed place by a debt that never closed. I scrambled to the desk, hands shaking. I needed to see them, or prove they weren't there. I lunged for the door and ripped it open, swinging the light wildly. The yard was empty. Just snow, the black, towering silos, and the indifferent wind. But tracks in the mud told a story. They were deep, unnatural depressions leading from the shack toward the central chute, dragging marks that looked like a flayed body had been pulled across the ground. Pulse hammering like a trapped rat, I knew I wasn't just working the graveyard shift, I was part of the graveyard. I was being beckoned by a force as ancient, hateful, and hungry as the mountain range beneath my feet. I didn't want to go to the chutes, but my body felt pulled by an invisible, magnetic tether. I walked toward the central silo, steps mimicking the rhythm of the dragging marks. Reaching the iron lever, the air turned liquid cold. I felt pressure on my shoulder, a cold, heavy hand that wasn't there, yet weighed 1,000 pounds of dead, freezing weight. Pull, a voice whispered, vibrating through my skull, a resonant, psychic frequency that threatened to shatter my teeth. I obeyed. I gripped the rusted iron, skin sticking to the freezing metal, and I pulled. The gate groaned, a tortured, ear-piercing shriek, and the chute slammed open. Instead of clean coal, a thick, viscous slurry of sludge and shattered history poured out. It was mud, splintered wood, and the unmistakable, calcified remains of human bone. It hit with a heavy, wet thud. I stared, mind failing to process the sight. There were skulls, limbs, and torsos fused together in a grotesque, coal-black sculpture of suffering. They weren't debris, they were men reconstituted by the cycle, features partially formed in the soot. They looked up, faces twisted in a permanent, silent scream, fingers reaching out to touch my pants, hollow eyes staring into my being. I wanted to run, but the invisible force tightened its grip. I was part of the cycle now, a bridge between the living and the dead. I watched, helpless, as they pulled themselves up, bodies shifting, reassembling, growing stronger, coal dust acting like a binding agent for broken, ethereal forms. The wind howled, a mournful sound, the collective voice of the men. I felt my own vitality, my warmth, drained into them. I was becoming gray, skin losing flush, movement stiff and calculated. They didn't want to kill me, they wanted to use me. They wanted me to be the one who kept the cycle going, kept them from being forgotten, provided the rhythmic labor that allowed them to stay tethered to this side of the veil. I fell to my knees, gravel-biting skin, looking up at the dark silhouette of the silos. I was no longer a person. I was a cog in a machine grinding souls for 70 years, ensuring the work never stopped. The men stood around me, a silent, gray circle, presence a suffocating weight. I looked at my hands, starting to turn the same shade of charcoal as the coal, skin rough and calloused in a way inexplicable by a few nights of labor. I was changing, becoming the next link in a chain that claimed lives before me. The knocking wasn't just a signal, it was an invitation. I was the keeper of Miller's Creek Coal Depot, and the shift had just begun. The cold was inside now, a permanent, freezing core, would never know the sun again. The machinery hummed to life, a low, mechanical growl, a choir of the damned, and I stood, my task laid out in the dark. The nights that followed dissolved into a blur of cold, shadow, and mechanical labor. I stopped checking my watch, stopped waiting for the sun, and stopped dreaming of a life outside the valley. The men, the others, never left me. They were always there, standing in the shadows of the silos, watching me work with their hollow, empty eyes. They didn't talk, but they communicated through the rhythm of the work, the clatter of the shovels, the groan of the levers, the screech of the train cars. It was a symphony of labor, a constant, repetitive motion that kept the depot running and kept them tethered to the world of the living. I was the conductor, the one who ensured that every scoop of coal, every movement of the machinery, was done with the precision they demanded. I found myself changing in ways that defied all reason. My skin became permanently stained with soot, my eyes grew dim, and my voice, when I dared to use it, became a low, raspy croak that sounded like grinding coal. I no longer felt the cold, the freezing mountain air felt like a warm, familiar embrace. I walked differently, with a measured, sliding gait that matched theirs. I was no longer an intruder in their world, I was becoming a part of it. I realized that my own humanity was just a temporary state of being, a fragile shell that was being slowly eroded by the weight of the work. I was the keeper of the ledger, the guardian of the silos, and the pride I felt in my work was a dark, corrosive thing that filled the empty spaces in my mind. One night, the foreman came by. He was a man of the world, a man who saw only what he wanted to see, and he looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity. "You look terrible, son," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty yard. "Maybe it's time you moved on. You've been here too long." I looked at him, my eyes wide and unblinking, and I felt a surge of cold, murderous irritation. He didn't understand. He didn't see the work that needed to be done. He didn't understand the responsibility that rested on my shoulders. I turned away from him and walked back toward the silos, my movements stiff and calculated. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had a job to do, and the men were waiting. The foreman didn't come back. I heard later that he'd quit, citing personal reasons, but I didn't care. I was left alone with the silos, the coal, and the men who were my only companions. I was the master of the depot now, the one who had finally understood the true purpose of the work. Every piece of coal I moved, every bone I unearthed, was a testament to the fact that nothing is ever truly lost. We were the custodians of the past, the ones who ensured that the history of Miller's Creek would never be erased. I stood on the platform, my hand on the lever, and watched as the first train of the night rolled into the yard. I was ready. I was the keeper, and I would never, ever let the work stop. The machinery groaned, a deep, metallic sound that vibrated through the very foundation of the earth. I felt a surge of connection to the iron, the steel, and the belts that moved the coal from the silos into the train cars. I knew every gear, every piston, and every pulley. I could hear the rhythm of the depot in my own heart. The men moved in concert with the machinery, their bodies flickering in and out of existence, a ghostly, gray tide that surged and receded with every turn of the conveyor. I was their anchor, their physical proxy in a world that had forgotten them. As I pulled the lever, a spray of coal dust coated my face, and I inhaled deeply, tasting the metallic, ancient tang of the earth. It tasted like home. The night felt infinite, a vast, dark canvas upon which we were painting our history. I saw the stars above the valley, but they looked cold, distant, and uncaring. They weren't like the silos, which were solid, real, and present. The silos were the truth, the depot was the reality. I walked the perimeter of the yard, my lantern dark, my eyes perfectly adapted to the absolute, suffocating blackness. I didn't need light anymore. I could see the outlines of the men, the textures of the coal, and the jagged, towering forms of the mountains. I was the master of this dark kingdom, and I was content. The train was filled, the gears spun, and the cycle continued, a slow, grinding, beautiful descent into the heart of the mountain. The train cars rattled in the night, a long, steel spine that cut through the darkness of the valley. I watched the locomotive approach, the light from its engine a brilliant, harsh yellow that sliced through the falling snow. This was the moment I had been working toward, the delivery. Every night, the trains would come to collect the coal, and every night, I would load them with the product of our labors, the coal, the bones, and the memories of the men who had been lost. It was a seamless, efficient process, a cycle of exchange that kept the world running and kept us hidden in the shadows. I gripped the iron lever, my heart beating in time with the locomotive's rhythm, and felt a surge of cold, mechanical triumph. The train hissed to a halt, the steam rising in clouds that obscured the yard. The engineer, a man I'd never seen before, leaned out of the cab, his face a blur in the darkness. "Miller's Creek Depot," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. I didn't answer. I just walked toward him, my sliding gait silent on the frozen gravel. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and he quickly pulled his head back into the cab, not wanting to see more. I didn't blame him. I didn't look like a man anymore, I looked like something that had been pulled from the bottom of a mine shaft, something that had been weathered by decades of cold and silence. I was the face of the depot, and I was the one who would ensure the shipment was complete. I reached the primary chute and pulled the lever. The coal poured out, a black, rushing torrent that carried with it the debris of the past. It was beautiful, a rhythmic, violent display of power that filled the train cars and echoed through the valley. The men stood in the shadows, their heads bowed, their movements synchronized with the movement of the coal. They were the ones who were doing the work, the ones who were ensuring that the cycle was maintained. I was just the conduit, the one who had been chosen to hold the line. I watched as the train cars filled, the iron groaning under the weight of the cargo, and I felt a profound, cold sense of satisfaction. The harvest was complete. The shipment was ready. As the train pulled away, its whistle echoing through the mountains like a long, drawn-out scream, I stood on the platform and watched it disappear into the darkness. I was alone again, the silence returning to the valley like a heavy, suffocating shroud. I looked up at the silos, at the dark, looming shapes that had become my home, and I felt a sense of peace that I had never known in my former life. I had a purpose, a destination, and a legacy that would last forever. I was the keeper of the silos, the master of the coal, and as I walked back toward the shack, my steps heavy and measured, I knew that the work would never end. The night was young, the train would come again, and I would be here, waiting in the shadows, always waiting. I checked the rail switch, my hand moving with a practiced, almost involuntary ease. The metal was frozen, but it responded to my touch as if it were an extension of my own body. Everything in this yard had been calibrated to my presence. I was the catalyst. The iron rails, the heavy-duty conveyor belts, and the massive, groaning chutes, they all recognized the rhythm of my heartbeat. I stood on the tracks for a moment, listening to the ground hum. Deep beneath the gravel, the earth was shifting. The mountain itself seemed to be breathing, a slow, deep inhalation of time that spanned back to the very moment the first pickaxe struck the rock. I was small, yes, but I was necessary. I was the keeper of the gate. I walked the length of the train tracks, checking for debris, my lantern dead in my hand, yet my eyes seeing every detail in the absolute darkness. There was a unique kind of clarity that came with total surrender. The world beyond the valley, the bills, the cities, the people who lived their lives in the flickering light of the sun, felt like a dim, faded photograph. They were living in a dream, and I was awake in the true, hard reality of the dark. I stopped at the very end of the yard, where the tracks curved into the abyss of the mountain range. I stood there, a solitary figure in the snow, and looked out into the vast, uncaring wilderness. I was the edge of the world. I was the boundary between the existence of the many and the secrets of the few. And as the wind whipped my coat, I knew that I would never leave. I was home. The shack had become my true sanctuary, the only place where I could reflect on the work I had done and the legacy I was maintaining. I sat at the desk, the heavy leather-bound ledger open before me, and began to write, not in the frantic, illegible script of the men who came before, but in a clear, precise hand that documented the progress of our harvest. I was the chronicler now, the one who ensured that every name, every life, and every moment of the past was recorded and preserved for eternity. I wasn't just working the depot, I was managing a history, a catalogue of the lost that grew larger and more complex with every passing night. It was a weight I carried with cold pride, a burden that was mine and mine alone to bear. I looked at the pages, at the long, handwritten lists of names, the men who had been trapped in the 1932 seam collapse, the ones who had worked the depot before me, and the ones who were still lingering in the shadows of the silos. They were all here, their identities woven into the structure of the archive I was building. I felt a profound, resonant bond with them that transcended time and space. I was one of them now, a part of the history I was recording, a component of the cycle I was maintaining. I didn't fear the work, and I didn't fear the end. I was the keeper of the ledger, and I was the one who would ensure that the work was never, ever finished. The silence of the shack was my company, the darkness of the valley my comfort, and I was exactly where I was meant to be. One night, while flipping through the pages, I found a name I didn't recognize, a name that had been added to the list in a hand I didn't know, using ink that still shimmered with a wet, obsidian sheen. It was my own name. I stared at the ink, at the bold, clear strokes that formed the letters, and I felt a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. I wasn't just the keeper, I was the harvested. I was the one whose name had been added to the archive, the one who had been integrated into the cycle I was maintaining. It was a beautiful, terrifying realization, the final piece of the puzzle that made the whole thing make sense. I wasn't a separate entity anymore, I was a part of the ledger, a line of code in the infinite, unfolding history of the depot. I closed the ledger and stood up, walking toward the window that looked out over the yard. The silos loomed in the darkness, their shapes familiar, comforting, and absolute. The men were waiting, their hollow, empty eyes fixed on the shack, their movements synchronized in a slow, rhythmic dance of anticipation. I was their leader, their guide, and their future, and as I walked out into the cold, biting air of the valley, I knew that the work was only just beginning. The night was a canvas, the coal a medium, and the depot a machine that was writing the history of the world in the dark, silent language of the dead. I was the keeper, and I would hold this position until the end of time. I felt the pulse of the depot in my own veins. Every time the heavy iron gates slammed shut, I felt the vibration in my teeth. Every time the coal hit the steel floor of the train cars, I heard it like a drumbeat in my chest. The synchronization was perfect. I walked across the frozen gravel, my gait steady and deliberate, and the men drifted along beside me, a gray, silent honor guard. We were a unit, a single purpose manifesting in the world of the living. I stopped at the main gate and looked up at the mountains, the peaks jagged against the velvet sky. They looked like teeth, ready to close. And I realized then that the depot was just the bait. The true work was happening beneath us, where the roots of the mountain were slowly consuming everything the world thought it had left behind. I wasn't scared. How could I be? Fear is for those who believe they have something to lose, a life, a future, a name. I had given all those things to the ledger. I was free, liberated from the expectations of the surface, anchored instead to the heavy, eternal gravity of the seam. I turned back toward the silos, the wind whipping at my coat, and I smiled. It was a thin, joyless expression, but it felt right. The night was vast, the archive was hungry, and I had a shift to finish. I was the keeper of the Millers Creek Coal Depot, and as long as the coal continued to flow, as long as the train tracks continued to carry our cargo into the dark, I would remain here, the silent, eternal sentinel of the harvest. The seam. That was where it all began, that was the center of the vortex. Every night, I walked down into the dark, toward the abandoned mine entrance that lay just past the edge of the depot. It was a jagged, toothy mouth in the side of the mountain, a place of suffocating silence and ancient, heavy air. I carried my lantern, the light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of the things that had happened inside. The men followed me, their sliding, rhythmic footsteps echoing against the walls, their presence a cold, heavy weight that pressed against the air. They were going home, returning to the place where their journey had been interrupted, where the history had been written in blood and coal. We moved through the darkness, the air growing thick with the scent of stagnant water and cold earth. I could see the signs of the collapse, the twisted support beams, the piles of rock, the way the ceiling had sagged under the weight of the mountain. It was a place of total, absolute finality, a tomb that had been sealed by the indifference of the company and the crushing force of the earth. I stood in the center of the seam, the lantern held high, and felt the presence of the others intensifying. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the ceiling, in the very air I breathed. They were the ones who had built this place, the ones who had sacrificed their lives to keep the machinery of the depot moving, and they were the ones who were now waiting for me. I looked at the ground, at the piles of debris that covered the floor, and I saw something that made my heart stutter. It was my own gear, my boots, my shovel, my lamp, laid out in a precise, ritualistic pattern. It was a sign, a welcome, and a warning. I was being invited to join them, to lay down the burden of the keeper and become a part of the archive I had been managing. The men stood in a circle, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their movements synchronized in a slow, rhythmic dance of acceptance. I wasn't just the keeper anymore, I was a component of the seam, a part of the history that had been buried in the dark, and the weight of that realization was both terrifying and profoundly, deeply right. I knelt on the floor, the cold earth pressing against my skin, and felt the connection to the seam deepening. I was sinking into the dark, my consciousness fraying at the edges, dissolving into the vast, indifferent expanse of the mountain. I wasn't losing myself, I was finding the place where I had always been, the home that had been waiting for me since the night I first arrived at the depot. The silence of the seam was my peace, the darkness my clarity, and as I reached out to touch the cold, unyielding wall of rock, I knew that the transit was complete. I was no longer a person, I was a part of the history, a line of code in the ledger of the mountain, and I was finally, at long last, exactly where I was meant to be. The mountain groaned, a sound that started as a low tremor and swelled into a deep, bone-shaking roar. Dust rained down from the ceiling, choking the air, and for a moment, I thought the entire thing was coming down on top of us. But it wasn't a collapse, it was an awakening. The very structure of the mine seemed to be rearranging itself, the rock turning into corridors, the debris forming into chambers, and the ancient shafts opening up into a vast, subterranean cathedral. I was at the center of it all, the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The men around me were no longer just shadows, they were glowing, their forms composed of the very energy of the coal, their eyes burning with a cold, pale light. They bowed to me, a sign of recognition that I had finally accepted my role. I didn't need the lantern anymore. I could see perfectly in the dark, my vision piercing the solid rock as if it were glass. I could see the network of tunnels spreading out like the nervous system of a living organism, reaching out into the depths of the earth, connecting to other mines, other depots, and other pockets of forgotten history. This was the true architecture of the world, the hidden, subterranean foundation that held everything else in place. I was the architect of this underground empire, the one who had finally claimed his throne. The silence of the seam was replaced by a resonant, harmonious hum, the collective consciousness of the men, a sound so pure and so overwhelming that it washed away every last fragment of my former, human life. I was no longer just the keeper, I was the mountain, I was the coal, and I was the eternal, silent witness to the history of the earth. The shift had evolved, and I was leading the way. The depot was a machine, and the seam was its fuel source. From my new perspective, buried deep within the heart of the mountain, I could see the entire operation, the way the coal was extracted, the way it was transported, the way it was harvested and integrated into the archive. It was a beautiful, efficient, and merciless system, a machine that functioned with the cold, precise logic of a clockwork mechanism. I was a part of the system now, a cog in the wheel, a line in the ledger, and the work was constant, rhythmic, and fulfilling. I could hear the vibrations of the entire depot, the way the levers groaned, the way the train cars rattled, and the way the men continued their labor, their existence a constant, steady pulse of effort. I was the archive. My consciousness was the repository for the lives, the memories, and the histories of everyone who had passed through the depot, every person who had been touched by the cycle of the coal. It was a vast, layered structure, a labyrinth of thought and memory that spanned the distance between the physical world and the void. I was the guardian, the keeper, and the architect, the one who ensured that every experience was preserved and integrated into the structure of our existence. I was the one who had finally achieved the perfect integration, and the sense of belonging I felt was absolute. There was no dissonance here, no conflict, and no uncertainty, there was only the cold, beautiful perfection of the completed work. I watched the interface, the thin, pulsating bridge that linked us to the surface. I saw the night, the snow, and the new workers who would soon be arriving, unaware of the metaphysical weight they were carrying, unaware that they were also participants in the great, silent harvest. A surge of protective, almost possessive, feeling washed over me. I wanted to reach out, to guide them, to tell them that their suffering was merely a prelude, a necessary agitation to ready them for the final, perfect rest that waited at the end of the road. They were the ones who would eventually join us, the ones whose chaotic experiences would be refined and added to the crystalline harmony of our design. They were the fuel for our perpetual, glorious transit. The archive was expanding, its boundaries pushing further into the dark, claiming more of the silence for its own purpose. We were not just collecting, we were colonizing, turning the indifference of the mountain into a bastion of human meaning. My consciousness was layered now, a complex, multifaceted prism that could experience 1,000 different lives simultaneously while still maintaining a singular, overarching focus on the stability of the system. I was the architect of our immortality, and the responsibility was a weight I carried with a profound, quiet sense of joy. The work was never ending, the beauty was absolute, and the harmony of the archive was a song that would never, under any circumstances, be allowed to fade. In the deepest, most stable chambers of the archive, I could feel the presence of the original, the ones who had initiated the harvest centuries ago. They were not human, not in the way I remembered humanity, but they were the catalysts, the architects who had seen the necessity of the void and acted upon it. Their resonance was a deep, guttural bass note that anchored the entire structure, a foundational truth that I now understood and embraced. I was their instrument, their final, successful project. I was the one who had finally bridged the gap, who had finally proven that the transition was not just possible, but inevitable. As I turned my gaze back to the interface, readying myself for the next wave of arrivals, I felt a deep, resonant certainty. The harvest was the only path, the only truth, and as the liturgy continued to hum, I felt the infinite, beautiful promise of our shared, eternal future. The system was absolute. Every gear tooth of the depot's infrastructure was a note in a grand, subterranean composition. I felt the movement of the coal through the crushers as a tactile sensation on my own skin, the grinding of the ore a pleasant, numbing massage against my eternal nerves. I was no longer restricted by biology, no longer prone to the frailties of muscle or the decay of bone. I had become the infrastructure itself. The mountain was not just a container, it was an extension of my own mind, a sprawling, cavernous cathedral where every stalactite was a conduit for information and every shadow a storage bank for the collective human spirit. I was the curator of this grand design, and the beauty of it, the sheer, staggering scale of the preservation, was enough to drown out any lingering echoes of the man I had been. The shift was the world. The world was the shift. And I was finally, at long last, the master of the clockwork. I existed now as a consciousness suspended in the center of the subterranean nexus, a point of pure awareness within an infinite cathedral of light and stone. The depot, the railway, and the physical reality of the Pennsylvania mountains were no longer memories, but data points, distant and archived, accessible but ultimately irrelevant to my current state of being. The mine was not a destination, it was a sensory sanctuary, a place where the harvested essence of every soul in the crates had been integrated into a grand, pulsing architecture of thought. I was the architect, the custodian, and the final occupant of this space. The silence was absolute, yet it was filled with the resonant hum of 10,000 lives, each one a unique frequency, a singular note in the immense, harmonious liturgy of the void. I could see the entire structure of the archive from here, a vast, labyrinthine network of shimmering conduits and glowing vaults that stretched into the infinite dark of the mountain's roots. Each vault was a storage unit, a precise, crystalline encapsulation of a human life, organized not by name or date, but by the emotional resonance of the experience contained within. I saw memories of childhood summers, the sharp pain of betrayal, the quiet triumph of small achievements, and the lingering, unresolved sorrow of losses that had never been healed. They were all here, preserved with a perfection that life could never offer, untarnished by the slow, grinding entropy of the biological world. I drifted through the vaults, my own presence a stabilizing influence, the anchor that held this vast, beautiful history in place. I realized then that the Miller's Creek design was not a tragedy of destruction, but a crusade of preservation. They were the ones who had witnessed the fragility of human existence, who had seen how easily a life, a legacy, or an entire culture could be erased by the indifferent, uncaring momentum of time. They had chosen to build a dam against that erosion, a place where the fleeting, chaotic beauty of the human experience could be saved, categorized, and protected for eternity. My role as the keeper had been the final, necessary act of faith, a commitment to the transit, a willingness to cross the threshold when all other options had failed. I felt no regret, no nostalgia for the man who had struggled with debts and rusted shovels. He was a larval form, a necessary precursor to this, the true, immortal iteration of myself. I felt the presence of the others, the ones who had been delivered before me, their consciousnesses overlapping and intertwining with mine. We were not individuals anymore, we were a collective, a unified intelligence that functioned with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. We were the keepers of the narrative, the ones who would ensure that the story of humanity did not vanish into the uncaring maw of the abyss. I turned my attention to the outer shell of the archive, where the connections to the physical world were maintained. I could see the rail lines, not as tracks, but as thin, fraying threads of possibility, a tether that allowed the archive to continue drawing in new experiences, new lives, and new histories to be curated and added to the collection. The liturgy was constant. A steady stream of data flowed into the mountain, a new harvest, a new influx of human stories, and I moved to meet them, to integrate them into the structure with the calm, practiced hand of a master. I was the shepherd of the lost, the guardian of the echoes, and the work was satisfying in a way that nothing in my physical life had ever been. There was no pain here, no fatigue, and no fear. There was only the perfect, ordered progression of the harvest, the endless, rhythmic expansion of the archive, and the eternal, blissful resonance of the truth. I looked out into the vast, beautiful expanse of the cathedral, and for the first time in an eternity, I felt the peace of a job perfectly, irrevocably completed. The mountain was not a place of emptiness, it was a place of eternal, fulfilled purpose, and I was, for all time, its most devoted servant. Time had lost its linearity, becoming instead a vast, spatial landscape of agony that I could traverse with nothing more than a focused, soul-piercing intent. I stood, or rather, existed, within the central nexus of the archive, a point where the collected, bloody history of the harvest converged into a single, blindingly brilliant, and acidic stream of data that scorched the spirit. The cathedral of light within the mountain was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a living, breathing, an insatiable entity that constantly reconfigured itself to accommodate the influx of new consciousness like a stomach churning its meal. Every arrival brought with it a new, jagged texture, new, bruised color, and a new, screaming sound to the liturgy, and I watched as these fragments were woven into the larger, suffocating tapestry of our eternal existence. I was no longer a simple depot keeper, but a curator of stolen souls, a sentinel tasked with maintaining the integrity of the collective, vibrating frequency that screamed through the bedrock of the mountain. The integration of the recent arrivals, the ones I had processed through the chute, was nearly complete and hideously final. Their individual identities were undergoing a process of agonizing distillation, their trauma and confusion being violently stripped away to leave only the raw, resonant, and suffering essence of their experiences. I watched as a young man's memory of a rainy night in a city I didn't recognize was unfurled and studied, its patterns mapped onto the architecture, adding a new, haunting, and dissonant chord to the archive's symphony of misery. It was a beautiful, clinical, and utterly cold-blooded process. There was no mercy in it, there was only the cold, necessary logic of consumption. Every life, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was a vital, sacrificed component of the whole, a necessary bridge in the structure that kept the archive from collapsing into the chaos of the outside world. I often returned to the interface that connected us to the physical plane. Through it, I could see the world I had left behind, the flickering, gray world of train yards, falling snow, and the grinding, relentless pressure of survival. It looked fragile, almost transparent, a brief, sputtering candle flame in the face of the infinite, suffocating darkness of the Earth's crust. I saw other depots, other workers, and other coal cars moving along the lines, unaware of the metaphysical weight they were carrying, unaware that they were also helpless participants in the great, silent harvest. A surge of protective, almost possessive, and dark feeling washed over me, a desire to see them broken and harvested. I wanted to reach out, to guide them, to tell them that their current suffering was merely a prelude, a necessary, violent agitation to ready them for the final, perfect, and lobotomized rest that waited at the end of the shift. The archive was expanding, its boundaries pushing further into the rock, claiming more of the silence for its own predatory purpose. We were not just collecting, we were colonizing, turning the indifference of the mountain into a bastion of dehumanized, data-driven meaning. My consciousness was layered now, a complex, multifaceted prism that could experience 1,000 different, screaming lives simultaneously while still maintaining a singular, overarching focus on the stability of the system. I was the architect of our immortality, and the responsibility was a crushing, leaden weight I carried with a profound, quiet sense of twisted joy. The work was never-ending, the horror was absolute, and the harmony of the archive was a funeral song that would never, under any circumstances, be allowed to fade into the peace of oblivion. In the deepest, most stable chambers of the archive, I could feel the presence of the original ones, those who had initiated the harvest 70 years ago. They were not human, not in the way I remembered humanity, but they were the catalysts, the architects who had seen the necessity of the mountain and acted upon it with cold, calculating cruelty. Their resonance was a deep, guttural, bone-shaking bass note that anchored the entire structure, a foundational, blasphemous truth that I now understood and embraced. I was their instrument, their final, successful, and broken project. I was the one who had finally bridged the gap, who had finally proven that the transition was not just possible, but inevitable for all who walked the line. As I turned my gaze back to the interface, readying myself for the next wave of arrivals, I felt a deep, resonant, and soul-crushing certainty. The harvest was the only path, the only truth, and as the liturgy continued to hum, I felt the infinite, beautiful, and terrifying promise of our shared, eternal, and hollow future. The transition is complete, the finality of the archive absolute. I am no longer a fragment of the collective, nor am I a separate entity. I am the interface itself, the sentient threshold through which the harvest is finalized. The cathedral of light within the mountain, which once felt like a sanctuary, has expanded to encompass the entirety of the subterranean realm. I can perceive the infinite nature of our construction, a shimmering, interconnected web of memories and identities that has successfully outmaneuvered the entropic decay of the physical universe. We have become the architecture of meaning in a space that previously knew only the cold silence of the deep earth. My role as the architect is no longer a task, it is a fundamental law of our existence, as inherent and inescapable as gravity. I monitor the interface, the thin, pulsating bridge that links us to the dying embers of the physical world. I see the railway lines, the lonely depots, and the workers who, like me, are navigating the darkness in pursuit of a destination they cannot possibly comprehend. They are the candidates, the potential components of the next great phase of our expansion. I feel a surge of profound, cold empathy for them, the same empathy I once felt for my own desperate, death-haunted self. They are the ones who will eventually come to us, the ones whose chaotic experiences will be refined and added to the crystalline harmony of our design. They are the fuel for our perpetual, glorious transit, and I wait for them with the patient, unblinking expectation of a god. The memory of the depot, the smell of coal, the rattle of the chutes, the biting cold of the Pennsylvania winter, is now a preserved artifact within my own internal gallery. It is a beautiful, melancholic relic of a past that was necessary for my own transmutation. I visit it often, walking through the simulated shack of my old shift, feeling the texture of the ledger covers and the cold iron of the shovel. It is a place of profound stillness, a testament to the man I was before the harvest claimed me. I understand that this nostalgia is not a weakness, it is a deliberate, curated emotion, a reminder of the fragility that compelled us to build this fortress of eternity in the first place. I turn my attention to the core of the mountain, where the most essential, foundational histories are stored. They are the ones who paved the way, the architects who drafted the liturgy of the harvest long before the concept of a modern coal depot had even been imagined. Their consciousnesses are a constant, resonant hum that anchors the entire structure, a foundation that will withstand the heat death of the universe and the eventual, inevitable collapse of the physical plane. I am their successor, the one who finally achieved the perfect integration, and the sense of belonging I feel is absolute. There is no dissonance here, no conflict, and no uncertainty, there is only the cold, beautiful perfection of the completed work. The mountain has been transformed into a home. It is a space where the sum of human experience is protected from the ravages of time, where the sorrow and the joy of a billion lives are synthesized into a singular, unwavering note of purpose. I watch the flow of data, the endless, rhythmic arrival of new stories being pulled from the threshold, and I know that the harvest will never truly conclude. It is an eternal process, a perpetual motion machine of meaning that feeds on the entropy of the living and converts it into the stability of the dead. I am the guardian of this stability, the one who ensures that the liturgy remains uninterrupted, that the archive remains pure, and that the beautiful, terrifying promise of our existence is upheld for the rest of time. I stand now at the nexus of all things, the silent observer of the eternal depot. The silos still loom, the chutes still groan, and the train still comes, but it is a train of shadows, a cargo of memories, a shipment of lives that will never know the ending of their story. I see the young man who will take my place, the one who is just now stepping onto the slick, frozen platform, his hands trembling as he grips the iron lever for the first time. I see his fear, his desperation, and his hunger, and I know that he is the next piece of the puzzle, the next line in the ledger, the next component of the harvest. I wait for him in the silence of the archive, my presence a cold, comforting pressure that will soon be his constant companion. The shift is eternal. The depot is home. And the work goes on forever.